Okay, so yeah, we can continue. I know that you probably watched 3 videos, short videos about the bone, but we're going to come to them on Friday because that's an important topic. But today we will continue with this chapter, which is chapter 6. And do you remember anything about the osteoclast cells from the videos that you watched? Do you know what they do? Yes. So you have this balance between osteoblast, that's a bone cell, bone forming cells, and then osteoclast are bone resorption cells. Now, can you write a story about the osteoblast? So, like, how does it work? To someone that he's not or she is not a have a page. You don't have to be technical, but yeah, let's see how would you describe what the functionality of osteoclast. And let me put a timer and make sure that you write your name on it because that's an important act. Yeah, and you decide the way that you would like to format this story. And here's the thing: the osteoclasts are multinuclei cells, and they come from macrophages. So they are actually an immune cell, and they come from macrophages. And macrophages are the cells that engulfs microbes and viruses. To be able to do this, they have to fuse together to make a big one. Now, when they are big like this, they start depositing protoglycans and enzymes to dissolve bone and minerals. Now, osteoblasts are just one nuclei cells, and they line up as one line, but osteoclast cells are big multinuclei cells that comes from macrophages, and then they start secreting acids and protoglycans to dissolve proteins and minerals in the body. And by the way, during our life, our bone actually gets built and resorbed 7 to 9 times. So the bone that we were born with is completely different from the bone that we actually have. And the imbalance in osteoclast, so if osteoclast and osteoblast activity balance is disrupted and osteoclasts are taking over, then we have osteoporosis. The reason of osteoporosis is the imbalance between osteoblast and osteoclast cells. Videos, what else we talked about in the videos about hydroxyapatite and the calciums. As engineers, you do mechanical testing to see the elastic modulus of healthy and osteoporotic bone, and that gives you insight about what the problem of bone actually is happening to them. The osteoblast cells, they come from mesenchymal stem cells from the bone marrow. Now, osteoclast comes from the bloodstream, from the macrophages and the immune system. And that's another distinction between the two. I gave too much information. Oh, I should have to write a story that explains the function of osteoclast. We need an S. And osteoclasts are, their job is very important because if there's any micro cracks in the bone, their job is actually to dissolve that part of the bone and osteoblast to rebuild it. So it works like a recovery mechanism for bone. But when it's imbalanced, now we have problem. When there is any imbalance between osteoblast and osteoclast, then we have problem between the two. But it's actually a very important role for bone. And one of the biggest problems for astronauts actually when they come back is that actually osteoclasts, we don't have gravity, and the body is now fooled by thinking that, well, why do we need all this bone? We need to make sure that we are using it in other places. And calcium and potassium and phosphate actually are used in other places in the body. So that's important. Okay, I will create a Dropbox at the end, and then you can take the picture and upload it there. Thank you. So now bone response to stress, Wolff law. That's the reason why we're talking about osteoclast, is that osteoblast and osteoclast actually act because of loading. And that's true. What Emily mentioned, if we don't exercise, if you're not stressing the bone, your osteoblast will stop creating hydroxyapatite. Now, here's the thing. What kind of loads do you think our bone mostly, exposed to? Is it bending, compression, tensile, or torsion? Compression. Most of our bones are actually under compression loads, especially lower extremity. Now, the hands are probably the only ones who can, experience a lot of tension because if you're holding things, that's where tension comes in. So how do bone respond to training? That is just like muscles, bone respond to certain kinds of training. And if there is, something called atrophy. Atrophy is the shrinking of bone or tissue because of something, or muscles. So muscles and bone experience atrophy if you are not exercising, and they're experiencing loads. Now there is something. So let's think about big. We understand that load will affect bone strength and deposition and all that thing. Now, if you go to the cellular level, what is happening is that the osteoplast and the osteoclast, what do you think they have on this? What are the things that they are dominant on the surface of a cell? What do you think they are on the surface of cells? What do we have? You have channels, right? Potassium and sodium channels. You have receptors. Now, these receptors, some of them are, we call them mechanotransduction receptors, which means that these receptors, they sense the change in mechanical properties around them, and then they will respond. Now, here's my question to you, another biology question. Do our cells live in liquid? Where do our cells reside actually? In which material? Or do you remember something called the extracellular matrix? So the cells live in extracellular matrix, so they don't swim in liquids. And this extracellular matrix, if we are doing exercise, we are stretching it. The osteoplast cells and osteoclast cells they have receptors on the surface called mechanotransduction receptors. They will feel the changes in the environment, and then they will react. So if you have a lot of stretching and compression in the extracellular matrix of the bone, cells will react and start making more bone. If you don't have any stretching or compression, the osteoclast will say, well, we don't have much activity, let me deposit more, do more acids and resorb the bone. Does that make sense with how it is? Now, here's the thing. Extracellular matrix for bone is different from the extracellular matrix of skin or muscles. Each cell type live in an environment that is telling the cells that I'm bone, or I'm tissue, or I'm heart, or I'm muscles. So that's something you need to keep in mind when you do this. Now, here's the thing. Osteoblast activity, this is hypertrophy. According to Wolff's law, he's one of the scientists, he said that the densities, to a lesser extent, the shapes and size of bone of a given human being are a function of the magnitude and direction of the mechanical stresses that acts on the bone. That's Wolff's law. So if we don't have any force in a specific direction, the bone will be resorbed. Some of this. One of the biggest problems, remember, we are engineers, right? Biomechanical engineers. One of the biggest problems what do you think the biggest problem for people who have total hip or total knee replacement? 100%. And what happened is that we have something called stress shielding, which means that the strong metal is now holding more load than it should be, and then the bone around it get dissolved, and then the implant comes out from its place. And we had incidences where the stem of the total hip is coming out from skin because it just cracks inside the body, because the bone around it is now very soft and it's very strong. The osteoclasts say, well, why do we need the bone around it if that is holding the stress on that thing? Yeah, so that's called stress shielding. That's a problem. Okay, what is bone atrophy? It's a decrease in bone mass resulting from a predominance of osteoclast activity, right? So the osteoclast is depositing a lot of acids and proteoglycans and dissolving the bone around them. And I'm going to show you pictures. When bone atrophy occurs, the amount of calcium contained in the bone diminishes. Where do you think the calcium will go? Where? To the bloodstream. And then people who have osteoporosis, when they do blood tests, they are trying to check how much calcium is in the bloodstream. Now, the problem with the bloodstream is that the calcium also can damage what other organ could be damaged because of high minerals in the blood. It could be but there's one more: kidney. We have kidney failure because of the minerals in the blood. And people who have osteoporosis, they have a big problem. Now, here's the thing: osteoporosis in female subjects usually comes after the menopause because of the imbalance of the hormones. In males, it's diabetes. So males who have diabetes, they develop osteoporosis actually as they have continued, if they're not taking care of them. Okay, we did that. So the bone weight and strength of the decreases because of the osteoclast. We good with this? How that thing works? Osteoplast and the osteoclast are continually building and resorbing bone. And remember, as I told you, our bone is a tissue that is always built and resorbed. So the thing is, increase or decrease in mechanical stresses lead to predominance of osteoplast or osteoclast. So if you are playing sports and you're active, your osteoplasts are continuously building bone and fixing damaged bone or cracks inside the bone. But if you don't have activities, you're in a big problem. So for the athletes of you, do you do weight-bearing exercise usually, right? So what do you do exactly with weight-bearing? Do you have weights on your body? So lifting is a weight-bearing exercise. What's the other one? So when you have these weights around your wrist and ankle, are those weight-bearing? When you do exercise, so if you're running with these, you will consider those as weight-bearing exercise, right? Okay. Uh, high impact sports. Do you know what kind of sport? High impact sports. Running is a high impact sport because you are compressing the bone of the leg. These two promote bone development. The larger the force acting on the musculoskeleton, the greater the osteoclast response. Now, do you remember what I told you about? What is the phenomena that translates mechanical stress to biological effect? It's called mechanotransduction. So the cells, they have receptors. These receptors will take the mechanical load from outside and then translate it into an action inside the cell to create more hydroxyapatite, to make more bone. So that's called mechanotransduction. Do you know why we call transduction? Because you move something from the mechanical into the cell activity, and that's called mechanotransduction. What tend to diminish bone density? Lack of weight-bearing exercises, bed rest. So people, if you're not active during the day, that's a big problem. Now, traveling space. NASA started the biomedical engineering discipline because of the effects of zero gravity on astronauts. Now, traveling space outside of Earth, we lose the gravitational field, and then the osteoclast and the osteoblast transduction phenomena get actually interrupted because we don't have weight. So how would we help maintain bone and muscle strength for astronauts? So we did, these kind of strap holding, treadmills, specialized for the surface. So you get the harnesses, right, and they place them and they push them down, and then you're asked to run or do walking, and that resulted in a really a good outcome. Okay, osteoporosis. Let's talk about osteoporosis because this is another problem that I'm interested in, similar to ACL tears. But if you are interested in bone, I'm a bone guy. I know everything about bone, and that was my grad school studies. So osteoporosis is a disorder involving decreased bone mass and strength, which can cause pain and fracturing while engaging in daily activities. And I probably told you why I'm passionate about osteoporosis, because a lot of, women in my family, they have this osteoporosis problem. And I know some of them, when they actually stand up from a chair, they break something. That's how bad that osteoporosis to them. And the thing that is begins as osteopenia, which is characterized by a predominance of osteoclast activity and reduced bone mineral density. Now, here's some problems. 50% of adults in the United States are affected by a musculoskeletal disorder, and the cost is $200 billion. It's a lot of money, actually. And we need to find ways to reduce this. 100 million adults in the United States are living with either diabetes or pre-diabetes. As I told you, males actually get osteoporosis because of diabetes, and a lot of them, they get actually misdiagnosed, and they don't even know that they have osteoporosis. And then suddenly, at one point in their life, they have these big fractures. So someone is falling or hitting a door or a chair, they fracture a hip or a femur. So that's a problem. Now, can you look at this picture? See this? This is a scanning electron microscope picture of bone. See this crack? That is going to be, millions of these cracks in the bone, and that characterize actually osteoporosis. Good with this? Alrighty. Who is affected by osteoporosis? Type 1 osteoporosis or postmenopausal osteoporosis affect 50% of women after the age of 50. And the reason why, so cells are controlled by hormones, right? Now, any imbalance in hormones would result in affecting the bone cells. So that's a big issue, actually. The other thing is that type 2 osteoporosis is age associated and affects most aging women and men. And the global prevalence of diabetes is actually the cause of osteoporosis for male subjects. We have 108 million people, and that was in 1980 globally. And this number is going to be went to 400 million in 2014, and that's the World Health Organization. That's a big number, actually, a very big number, a big jump. And what we are seeing now is that in developing countries, we have more problems with osteoporosis compared to developed countries. And that number is going to continuously increase. It's the big mess. Are younger people even affected by osteoporosis? So we have something called the female athlete triad, and the combination of the following factors. So we have low energy availability, menstrual dysfunction, and we have the diminished bone mineral density. These three things, actually, we are seeing that they are getting more and more prevalence among athletes, female athletes. And it's very important to do two things: to understand the medical challenge and then to find a way to ameliorate the effects of that problem. Okay, how can osteoporosis be prevented and treated? We have regular exercise is the key. And then we have weight-bearing exercises during childhood, and when they become adults, can help optimize peak bone. And one of the things that I keep telling people, you have to be at least once in your life really athletic or in good shape. That will help you a lot statistically, compared to someone who has never played sport or been in good shape. I've been in good shape when I was younger, but now it's not. So that's something you need to keep. Regular exercise have been shown to be effective to some extent. Now, the problem with osteoporosis is that it is a balance between two types of cells, and if there is any hormonal deficiency, that could, even if you are exercising, it's not going to help much. So each subject needs to understand what is the cause of osteoporosis before taking any action related to osteoporosis. Okay, how can osteoporosis be prevented and treated? Other strategies can help minimize bone loss: hormone therapy, adequate intake of dietary calcium and vitamin D. Now, I know that a lot of people are, lactose intolerant, right? So they don't drink milk, but they need to take calcium from other resources. And avoiding smoking and excessive consumption of protein, caffeine, and alcohol will be good. Now, all of this is descriptive, correct? Now, we as engineers, why we're learning about this? We need to understand how big the problem and then find solutions to this. The solution that we will act to. Let me ask you this question. Among the following, which one do you think is affecting bone the most? We're talking about bone. Electromagnetic waves, ultrasound, or electrical currents. Which one of these, you know what those are. So which one do you think will have the most effect on bone to make more osteoclasts, affect the osteoclast to make more bone? Ultrasound, because that's mechanical vibration, right? So we need to design tools and equipment that you can expose bone to ultrasound, and then you will heal the bone faster, or you can prevent it from being damaged. Does that make sense? Does that make sense how we were looking? And that's another a good capstone project, by developing an ultrasound transducer and try to affect places of bone to accelerate bone healing. So we talked about a medical problem. Now we talk about what kind of solution we can develop to affect the players of that medical situation. Okay, let's talk about common bone injuries. So osteoporosis is a big problem, but we also need to talk about injuries themselves. 50% of adults in the United States are affected with a musculoskeletal disorder. We talked about that. 200 billion is the treatment cost, and we have 100 million in the United States are living with diabetes or pre-diabetes. See, all of this means we'll have people with more fractures. Let me tell you something. If a subject is older than 60 years old and they experience a hip fracture, this is a lethal injury. They die. They're going to survive the hip fractures. So to us, with the aging population, we need to find solutions that we can help people, be healthier or be treated after an injury quicker, faster. And so if you want to, how would you define a fracture? It is a disruption in the continuity of bone. That's one. And it is exposing bone to a strength that is higher. So do you remember the stress strain curve? Do you know the points on the curve? What is the yield point? Yeah, so after the yield point, you getting into the plastic region, which means that you have permanent deformation to the tissue. What is the ultimate strength? We have fracture. So fractures happen when the bone is experiencing force or stress that is exceeding the ultimate strength. Now, let me ask you this question. What's the difference between force and stress? Over area. Perfect. So force divided by area is stress. The ultimate strength is actually that point, the stress that is, after which we have a fracture of the bone. So if you, and here's having this strength is one factor. There's another factor for fracture, which is in a specific direction. So we have a magnitude, we are exceeding the ultimate strength, and in a specific direction, because bone, if you're compressing on it, bone is designed in such a way that it withstand a lot of compressive strength, but it is very weak in bending. So if you are pushing on bone this way, that's compressive, you should be good. But if you bend it, it's going to crack. It's going to fracture. And the loading rate. Can you define fatigue? What is fatigue? Internal microscopic damages for tissue or material, right? Now, how fatigue develop is from something called cyclic loading, right? If you continuously keep doing load, unload, load, unload, you will get fatigue. So we will have the magnitude, the direction, and the loading rate and duration of the load. All of these sustain. If they are sustained, they will result in a fracture. Now, you can, as an engineer, study the direction of the force. And that's what we're trying to do with the ACL tear, to look at the rotational tendency to rotate, and the magnitude and the rating. I don't know, for ACL tears and osteoporosis, it could be actually the loading rate that causes the damage, not the load or the strength, because it's non-contact, right? So we could have had fatigue inside the ACL before actually playing the sport, and then that could lead to problems. And athletes might not know that they have, fatigue in their ACL. So recovery, I didn't see anything about recovery. How long should you wait before you do other, intense exercise to make sure that your ACL is healthy? So that's another topic to look at. Okay, what is fracture? Under excessive loading, bending loads, bone tend to fracture. Bone is designed to withstand compression, not bending, right? On side loaded in the tension. Now, do you know when we do bending, we have if I'm doing bending down this way, which one is experiencing compression side and which side tension, and the one compression? Usually bone fracture in the tension side. So the cracks of the bone always starts in the tension, not in the compression. Remember, bone is designed to withstand compression, but it is not designed to stand tension or bending forces. And that's what happened at the top. Tensile loading may cause a tendon or a ligament to pull a small chip of bone, and this is called evolution. And that's another problem. So I don't know, in ACL tears, they rupture in the middle, but sometimes you'll have ligaments and tendon. Which one is connected to bone? It's the tendon. Bone to bone are ligaments. Bone to muscles are tendons, correct? Now, the ligaments bone to bone, if one of them, you rupture it, it can take actually a piece of bone with it, and that's a big problem. Okay, excessive bending and torsion loads produce spiral fracture. So if your bone is healthy bone, and you are doing something torsional and you break the bone, you will have a spiral fracture with an angle like this. Now, if the bone is osteoporosis, do you know what happened to the bone? Or that bone is not healed well or soft, you will have a fracture like a very straight transverse line. So if we have a fracture like this, that one straight line, that means the bone is soft and it's weak, and it's not healed. There is a problem with the bone. Healthy bone, we should have a spiral fracture. Now, simultaneous application of forces from opposite direction generates bending moment, and the bending moment is the one that's going to do the fracture for us. Now, incomplete fracture, we could have a fracture like this, caused by bending or torsional loads, called green stick fracture, and it is representing you have a green, stick of a plant, and that's how it breaks. More common in children because their bone contain relatively larger amount of collagen and more flexible. As we go older, we have more calcium and potassium in our bone compared to kids. And don't forget the water content. That's another important aspect. Increased in magnitude or frequency of bone loading causes stress reaction. which may involve micro damage. That's the micro cracks, and that's fatigue. Okay, before bone remodel is complete, stress fractures may occur. So we can anything. If someone told you have a stress fracture, that means that are micro cracks in the bone before, and then it didn't heal. Now the osteoclast job is actually to search for these micro cracks, dissolve the bone there, and then rebuild it again with the help of osteoclast. So that's how they do this. Now, anything that is called stress fracture, it means that the bone is actually damaged already, and then for repeated testing, it just got damaged. If you have something like this, the fissured fracture involved an incomplete longitudinal break, and remember, we can tell the health of the bone based on the type of fracture. Let me repeat this. I would like the failure mode. See these things that I told you, the transverse fracture. This is called the failure mode, and we can tell the health of the bone based on the failure mode. Do you know forensics? People who study forensics, they look at the injuries and they can tell what happened. That's actually based on the understanding the failure modes of bone. Fissured fractured, and then you have communicated fracture, which is a complete fragments of bone are out of the, they're no longer in contact with the other tissue of them. It will be unhealthy if you are having smooth edges. If it's sharp edges, the bone, that's healthy. If it's smooth edges, it means that we have a lot of collagen, not calcium. And then, now here's the thing. This is the most complicated one because we need to have a lot of plates and screws to put them back together. And you as an engineer, your job is to design the plates and screws to be able to put this thing back to how it was. Okay, transverse fractures. This is bad. Any transverse fracture means that there is something wrong with the bone. It's a complete break at a right angle of the axis of the bone. Transverse, and usually these transverse fractures happen closer to the ends of the bone. Oblique fracture, this is good, this is healthy. This is tricky, this is questionable. We have something wrong in the bone. Oblique fractures occurs at the angle other than the right angle of the axis, and that means that the bone is healthy. We have a lot of calcium and it's strong enough. Now, epiphyseal injuries. So if you remember your anatomy, I think you covered bone, right, in the anatomy? You get into bone, yes. 10% of skeletal injuries in children and adults involve the epiphyseal. And the epiphyseal, I think it is the part of this here, right? This region and that region here, and that's epiphyseal. Include injuries to the cartilaginous epiphyseal plate, and bone grow longitudinally, correct? So that's the plate that grows, and then bone grow from it outward. And there's a lot of it's very soft, a lot of cartilage there. And that is the epiphyses of long bone are termed pressure epiphyses, and apophyses are called the traction epiphyses. So this is just anatomy. What I care about is we think about bone, correct? As an engineer, you need to understand the types of bone and the modes of failure. The reason why we learn this is for you to be able to design plates and screws. So if your bone is actually weak and you're putting in it plates and screws that they're very strong, you will have what Emily mentioned, the stress shielding, and then you make it an even worse problem. So the challenge with us is understanding the health of the bone so that when we put plates and screws, we select the correct materials for them. Does it make sense? You cannot use even the geometry of the plates and screws. If someone is osteoporotic, you can't use the same plates and screws that we have for someone who's healthy, not osteoporotic. You will be using different alloy, different material, and the shape of it, you will have a lot of threads in it because it's weak. You need to make sure that it is very attached to the tissue, rather than healthy one. You will have less threads on it, and the spacing between the threads also make a big difference. But yes, we use different alloys, and the latest material we are using to plates and screws is magnesium. And why do we use magnesium? Because it is resorbable. So now we have plates and screws made of magnesium. You can put them in the body and they dissolve with time, and your body will utilize the magnesium. That's the state of the art. That's the latest thing that we have. They did that to you. So we have something called osteochondrosis. Involves disruption of blood supply to an epiphysis. So let me tell you something. We have two ways of bone formation, right? We have something called endochondral ossification, and we have something called endochondral ossification that involves the chondrocytes and cartilage and osteoclasts. We have, I think, the other one is endochondral and forgot the name of the other one. Let me find that. Did I cover those in the videos? Yeah. Like the plates? Yeah. Endochondral, because we are so endochondral ossification process. We have that, and the other one, intramembranous. I didn't mention that, right? Okay. So if you have long bone fractures, the bone heals in a way called endochondral ossification. If you have flat bone fractures like the skull, we have something called intramembranous ossification. The difference between the two, if someone got an injured in their long bone, do you imagine that they will have some enlargement around the bone, swelling, right? That's because we are building a lot of cartilage, and then the osteoblast will come and put calcium in the cartilage in this big ball. And the things that, so if you have fracture, so if I'm fracturing these two things, our body, in order to stabilize it with a soft tissue, it's either building hard tissue around it or make it a sphere around it big so that it takes the load. And that's what the endochondral ossification. Now, endochondral ossification, and then you have chondrial ossification. Now, for long bones, yes. And the characteristic of endochondral ossification is that the body is going to build a sphere around the fracture to stabilize it using soft tissue. And then the osteoblast comes in and fill it with calcium. Now I have a very strong sphere. Osteoclast will come in and try to shave it in order to take the shape of the bone as the original bone. Now, in the skull, in the flat bone, we can't do that, because if you have a big sphere in the bone, in the brain, you're pressuring the brain, and that's going to cause a lot of problems. So we have something called intramembranous ossification, where the osteosome is the one that stem cells come from it, and we don't have to do the cartilage. So immediately we deposit calcium instead of doing the cartilage and have the sphere. Now, the sphere is important because it's long bone and you need to stabilize it. The skull is not moving, so we don't need that. So these two ways of ossification, the intramembranous and the endochondral ossifications, are important for us to understand when we pick plates and screws. Remember, some of you will be working for a striker, designing and training physician on putting plates and screws for people with fractures. That's part of biomedical engineering. So yeah, and we're going to be talking about this more actually when we meet, discuss the videos, because I want to explain that to you in more details. And we need to understand the steps or the phases of bone healing and metabolism to be able to design plates and screws and total hip and joint replacement. Remember, for this chapter, our knowledge need to focus on plates, screws, and total hip and joint replacements. That's your part of designing. Okay, do you have any questions about bone? I know I'm just repeating a lot of review information, but we're going to use them in design later on and talk about how to do designing plates and screws and what are the properties of plates and screws and where do you put them and how do you use them. And yes, Emily, we're going to discuss which type of plates and screws we're going to be using, because there's something called interlocking and unlocking and locking plates, and then the different types of screws that with the different heads and threads. We're going to discuss all of those for us. Yeah. Do you know the type of plates you have? And also, so the outer shell of the bone is called the periosteum, right? Now this periosteum is filled with mesenchymal stem cells that becomes osteoblast. Now if you have a big plate and you're pressuring on the periosteum, you're damaging the periosteum. So what they so they usually have these plates like this, right? Mm-hmm. Now what we have is something like that, plates, and then so that you don't want to pressure the periosteum, and you need to have, so this is called locked plate, and this is locked plate, and this is unlocked plate. And these are the things that you need to know about which type of plates they're using and the screws, and you have them.